Nobody seems to listen to anything anyway these days, do they? Especially me.
When the Beatles were at their peak of popularity.
One Beatle called his own band's music rubbish and meant it.
No, George, this is John. It's still fucking rubbish, you know.
Bang, bang, Maxwell Silverhat.
George Harrison spent over 100 hours recording a song that never made the album. He walked out of sessions calling Paul's tracks fruity, and when Paul invoked John Lennon's name to convince him, George still said no. Most musicians sugarcoat the past. George Harrison didn't. While Ringo stayed diplomatic and Paul tried to protect the legacy, George had a reputation for brutal honesty. He didn't just dislike certain Beatles songs, he despised them. And some are tracks millions of fans consider classics. What would make someone trash their own band's most celebrated work? Here are the 6 Beatles songs that made Harrison's blood boil and the stories behind why he never forgave them. 1. Maxwell's Silver Hammer.
Bang, bang, Maxwell's silver hammer came down upon his head.
Picture this. You're stuck in a studio for days recording the same song over and over. The arrangement won't change. Your bandmate is obsessed. And you're being treated like a hired session musician instead of an equal. That was George Harrison's hell during Maxwell's Silver Hammer. Sometimes Paul would make us do these really fruity songs, Harrison said years later. My God, Maxwell's Silver Hammer was so fruity. But the real knife in the back? Paul made them record it for days on end. Different takes. Same result. George and Ringo felt like background players, not Beatles. John Lennon straight up refused to participate, calling it granny music and walking out. And here's what haunted George most. Every hour wasted on Maxwell's hammer was an hour stolen from his songs. All Things Must Pass, My Sweet Lord. Masterpieces that got pushed to the side because Paul needed one more take of his novelty track. By the time it made the Abbey Road track list, George wasn't proud, he was bitter. The song became a symbol of everything wrong with the band's final days. Paul's control, George's marginalization, and the slow death of collaboration. Even decades later, Harrison couldn't hide his disgust whenever someone brought it up. 2. Obla di, Obla da. If Maxwell's Silver Hammer was hell, Obla di, Obla da was the prequel. The White Album sessions were already a disaster. Tension, egos, Yoko in the studio. Then Paul shows up with this cheerful ska number and decides it needs to be perfect. So they recorded it. Again, and again, and again. Different rhythms, different styles, dozens of takes. Nobody could escape. George and Ringo were exhausted. John was losing his mind. Finally, after yet another grinding session, a stoned John Lennon had enough. He stormed over to the piano and slammed out the opening chords louder, faster, more aggressive than anything Paul had tried. This, he announced, is how the song should be played. He basically hijacked the arrangement just to end the torture. But Paul wasn't done. When the song became a hit, he wanted to release it as a Beatles single, commercial gold. Right? John, George, and Ringo all said no. They'd spent too many hours trapped in that studio. They couldn't stomach the idea of promoting it. George later called the recording process one of the worst experiences of his Beatles career. Not because the song was terrible, but because it represented everything he hated about how the band operated. Paul's vision, Paul's control. And everyone else just had to deal with it. 3. Do you want to know a secret?
Listen, do you want to know a secret?
Imagine being handed a song because your bandmates think you need practice. That's exactly what happened to George Harrison in 1963. Do You Want to Know a Secret was written by Lennon and McCartney, but they didn't want to sing it themselves, so they gave it to George as a vocal exercise, like handing the easy part to the kid who can't keep up. John admitted it years later without shame. He wasn't so good in those days. He improved over the years, so it was important that slowly, with not so complex songs, he started to sing more. Translation? They thought George was the weak link. The song was labeled innocent and sweet. George's performance, also labeled innocent and sweet, and not in a good way. It was patronizing. A pat on the head. A good job, buddy. From the cool kids who actually ran the band. Harrison hated it. Not just the song, the entire experience of being treated like a backup singer in his own group. Years later, he complained bitterly. Nobody ever told me how to sing it. What he really meant was, nobody took him seriously. By 1963, George already knew where he stood. Outside the Lennon-McCartney empire, outside the real decisions. A guitarist with a nice voice, who occasionally got thrown a bone. Do you want to know a secret? Wasn't just a song, it was a reminder that George was never going to be an equal in the Beatles, and he never forgot that feeling. 4. Don't Bother Me. This one cuts deep because it was George's first real attempt at songwriting for the Beatles. Summer 1963. George is sick in bed in a hotel room, frustrated, probably feverish. And he writes Don't Bother Me, a moody, defiant little song that could have been his breakthrough moment. Instead, it became something he tried to forget. It wasn't a very good song, Harrison admitted later. I came to forget it completely once it was on the album. But here's the painful irony you need to understand. The lyrics of Don't Bother Me read like George's actual feelings about being sidelined in the band. It's about being left alone, dismissed, told to wait your turn. It's practically a confession. And what happened? Years later, when he tried to get songs onto the White Album, even this track, his first ever composition, felt like a ghost. A reminder of how little had changed. George needed John and Paul's support to get his material heard. They didn't need him. That power imbalance crushed him. So Don't Bother Me ended up in this weird, sad limbo. Too personal to love, too early to be good. A reminder that even when George tried to assert himself, the Lennon-McCartney machine barely noticed. He didn't hate the song because it was bad. He hated it because it represented everything he couldn't control in the Beatles. His voice, his contributions, his place in the band. 5. Not Guilty. Over 100 takes, countless studio hours, and for what? Not Guilty is the song that perfectly captures George Harrison's nightmare during the White Album sessions. By 1968, the Beatles were barely functioning as a band. John and Paul could work independently, they didn't need help. But George? He needed collaboration. He needed support. He needed his bandmates to care about his songs. They didn't. The band recorded Not Guilty over and over, more than 100 takes. They tried different arrangements, different tempos. George kept pushing, thinking that if they just got it right, John and Paul would finally see what he was trying to create. But even the best take couldn't convince them. When it came time to finalize the White Album tracklist, Not Guilty didn't make the cut. Think about that, over 100 takes, and it still wasn't good enough for the album. George was furious, humiliated. All those hours of work, all that effort, dismissed like it never happened. The song became a bitter memory he didn't want to touch. He shelved it for over a decade. When he finally recorded it again in 1979 for his self-titled solo album, he completely reworked it into a softer, gentler version. The anger was gone, or maybe just buried. Not Guilty wasn't just a rejected song. It was proof that no matter how hard George worked, he'd always be the third wheel in the Beatles. And that reality broke something in him that never fully healed. 6. Now and Then. Jump forward to the 1990s. The surviving Beatles are working on the anthology project. Yoko Ono hands them John's old demo tapes, unfinished songs from 1979. Free as a Bird gets released. Then Real Love. Both massive successes. Next up, Now and Then. Paul McCartney loved it. It had a very good title, he said. Nice verses. You could hear John's voice singing it. George Harrison? He wanted nothing to do with it. George didn't want to do it, Paul explained later. We started working on it, but George went off it.
Now, George, this is John. This is still fucking rubbish, you know. Okay, then.
Let that sink in. Paul invoked John's name, the ultimate trump card, and George still refused. The official story blamed background hiss that couldn't be removed with 1990s technology, but that was just the cover. The real reason Now and Then was shelved was George's total disinterest. He didn't care if it was John's voice. He didn't care if fans wanted it. He was done. The song sat unreleased for decades until modern AI technology finally made it possible to restore John's vocals. But by then, George was gone. They finished it without his approval because they didn't need it anymore. George Harrison had checked out of the Beatles long before he died. Now and Then was simply the final proof.